All right, so for this video, we're going to talk about setting up our characters. Okay, so right now we have a player character. We have the character he can jump, he can dive. We have it where the player can do an idle and attack. We don't have enemies. We need to build some type of collision. We need to know when the player is getting hit by some type of enemy. We need to know when the player is jumping on an enemy or headbutting an enemy or whatever we're doing for our stuff. So there's a number of things that we need to do in this project. And it all kind of starts with we have to be able to create the enemies. And we have a lot of stuff already that we've created. We have a player that's built off of a dynamic creature. We already set up a class where the dynamic creature is going to be any moving entity in our game. So we have a player, and that should also include our enemies. But we are going to have to make some changes. We mentioned before that we are probably going to have to refactor because dynamic creature is, in a general sense, it's just the dynamic creatures, but my player is different than my enemies. They're not exactly the same. Yes, they do have many of the same components, but there are some things that are different. So in this case, if we consider an infinite platform runner, what that is that basically I'm not moving side to side. My player is not moving forward. He's staying stationary on part of my screen. Okay? All he's doing is he's jumping up. He's doing his different moves. Now my enemies, they are always, even at a stop state, if the enemy was idle, they're always going to be marching toward the player because my player is going to have some type of speed. Okay? This speed that the player has is going to dictate how fast my enemies will move. My enemies may have a speed, which they may be walking or running, but that will be added to my player speed. So this will also be there, plus the player speed, okay, which will change based off of, say, if I'm in an idle state or I'm in a moving state. So that's ultimately what we're kind of looking for when we're trying to design this, that the enemy will be moving towards the player. The player is going to choose to jump on them, do whatever that stuff is. But it's dictated by the speed of the player. And additionally, we have more stuff than that, than just our enemies. We have parallax backgrounds, which is something that we need to get into. So here, if we look, the very back layers, they move much slower than the front layers. And that is ultimately what we're looking at getting and doing, because that will give a much better illusion of the movement. Okay, so this is something like when we're looking, that very background that's almost not moving, the sky in front of it might be moving a little bit more. We have this perception of movement. Okay, so where we're going with this, ultimately, see, I have my player, he's in an idle state, and I have an enemy. Now the enemy, this is where we need to start. We have to design the enemy. The enemy is moving at a certain speed. And once we get off the screen, then the enemy is resetting. We're reusing our stuff. If, however, I jump up in the air and I start a run state, now I'm running, but now it looks like regardless of the speed that the enemy is moving, now they're passing me much faster because they're coming towards me and I'm also coming towards them, even though I have never moved my position. Okay? So this is what we're ultimately going for. The illusion will be more complete once we actually have a background built into it. But we can play. Obviously, we have no collisions or anything, but we can't have collisions until we have our enemies. So that's what we're kind of looking at. Ultimately, we want to get somewhere like this. We have enemies that they're going to collide with our hitboxes. We have different hitboxes that will do different things. I have a foot sensor that I can use to jump on enemies' heads. If they end up hitting me, Right now, I just have where they are resetting. Okay, so we want to be able to design these hitboxes. If they hit me, they're taking some of my health, or they're taking a power up away, any of that stuff. If I am doing some type of attack, then I can check if that was hitting. Here I have my foot sensor. If that collides with the enemy's head or their body, and I don't collide, they don't collide with my head or my body, then I can do a jump on their heads. So this allows us to have functionality. We are going to be building this into a finite state machine. So, that's ultimately what we're looking at. We first need to design this enemy. So, we're kind of like, we need to first refactor our player. Okay, so this needs to be refactored to have our player, and then we need to design an enemy. Now, we can use much of the same stuff that we've done before. We need to have an enemy class. Now, I may end up having different enemies based off of the situation that I have, the game that I'm making. I might have flying enemies, might have ground enemies, and so I could have subclasses of enemies within my enemy. I could have easy enemies, medium enemies, difficult enemies. All of those could be designed in here, okay? So we are going to start kind of, for this first video, we're going to refactor our player a little bit, and then we're going to build the enemy one. Putting in all the animations that we need for one enemy. You guys will be responsible for doing at least one other enemy. In future videos, we will end up having to have a more difficult AI, so I want that already set up so we can design around it. Okay, so after we get that, that's when we can start setting up the hitboxes. So we'll have to design those classes, and then we'll have to, optimize how we're checking against our player. If we look here, I don't need to check every single enemy that's in my game. I only have to check enemies that are close to my player that I could collide with. Okay, so that is also a way that we want to optimize, and we can do that by making kind of custom hitboxes. I have, in this one, I have a head, I have a body, I have a foot, which we've seen the foot, but I have this bigger one, which is my radar. And I have my radar, depending on what state I'm in, be positioned in a certain way. When I jump up, I actually want it to be leading in the direction that I'm going up, so that I can capture any enemies that I might collide with really quickly, and then those are the ones that I would check for a collision. When I come down, I want it to shift down towards the bottom. If I go down fast, like a dive, I want it almost directly below me. And in this one, we have an additional state. We have a duck state or a slide state, and it changes the size of these hitboxes. So we're going to need to modify these. Okay, so to do this, to be able to create this, we need to go to our original state. So this is 3-2. Everything's the same. We are able to jump. We can hold the jump. We can do a quick jump. When we're jumping, we can push down to dive. Okay, so that is all of our animations, our states. They're all designed in there. We have the idle states. We have the die state. If I was looking at that to see it happen, let's start a die state. There's the die state right there. I have it automatically transitioning to a run state, but I can also do this, say, for an idle state. Here's my idle state. Okay, so now what we need to do is we can use much of the stuff that we've already done for a player to start designing our enemies. Okay, but like what I was saying, when we create our player, let's look at our dynamic creature. Okay, we pass in, we say what type it is, we give it a position, a velocity, dynamic versus map, dynamic versus dynamic, friendly, health, and a speed. Okay, now the speed is my player speed. Now this is something that we are passing in as a set speed that we want the player to do. Now this should be a value that we are maintaining that as we progress in our game and say we covered 500 meters, 1 mile, 2 miles, that we speed it up so that ultimately we're speeding up all of the enemies and the background. Okay, so we do want to make some changes to this, because once we pass in a value, we are going to want to be able to tweak those values, but we don't want to be able to directly tweak the values of the enemy. We want to directly tweak the values of the player, because that should be what drives it. So we're going to do a little bit of refactoring. Okay, so I want to duplicate this, and this is going to be multiple parts. Okay, so yes, we're doing this is going to be a walkthrough challenge, but it's going to be multi-part. Okay, so the main goal of this, we already have the FSM that's been designed. We've set that up. This is going to be more for enemies and collisions. Walkthrough challenge. Okay, so that's what our focus is on what we're going to be designing. Okay, now we have, because we're going to have multiple enemies, so let's look at this. In the Ninja Run game assets, we have enemy sprites. Let's look at the first one. And in my mind, I actually have this kind of designed as it's going to be different enemies. So here I have this enemy that is going to be walking and doing some type of attack. This is going to be my easy enemy. I want to see this one a lot. So this one is going to be like my basic AI. I might have, now if I look at the states, I have an attack state, I have a die state, I have an idle state, and I have a walk state. With this, because I'm doing kind of simple AI, my enemy will, more than likely I'll have him attack, or maybe it's got a percentage if he will attack based off of maybe what my speed is or how far I ran or something to that effect. He will attack by doing an attack command, but I can also have him randomly either just stand where he's at, or he could be walking towards me. Okay, now if I was going with different enemies, a harder enemy, maybe I'm having this one that also has the same states: attack, die, idle, and walk. Maybe I might have this one that this enemy tries to stay on the same platform as me. So if I jump up onto a higher platform, I want this enemy also to jump up with me. And then maybe I might have a harder enemy like this one. Again, the same states, but maybe this one, he will change his speed. So maybe he's going towards me, and then he moves back a little bit when I try to do an attack, and then he'll move faster. So his speed can get modulated based off of what's going on. Or maybe I have him running all the way past me and he turns around and he tries to attack me from behind. There's multiple things that I could do with this. Okay, so let's start designing this. Okay, and first off, we need to create another class for the player. Okay, so we're going to create a file. We're going to call it player.js. Okay, and now this is going to extends the dynamic creature class. Okay, I'm still going to have the same constructor. So let's just find what we have to pass in the dynamic creature class. All of these, type, position, speed, health, all that stuff. We want all of that in there. Okay. We're still going to end up passing that stuff into the dynamic creature. Okay. What we do want though, we have, when we create our player, we're going to have that speed that we're setting. Okay. And so that speed is going to be, let's call it this dot. So we are going to be holding that speed. Actually, that's already going to be on there. I don't need that. But what we are going to need to do on here specifically is we're going to have a number of functions to be able to change the speed. Okay, so all the other ones, we shouldn't really be able to change them. We're changing through the player. So let's do, how about a change speed? And we can give it some type of value. And then that's going to be this dot speed equals the value. All right. But if I do that, I may need to hold what the previous speed was. So previous speed, previous speed is going to be also that, whatever that speed is. I'm just passing it there. Okay. So that means that if I'm going to change my speed, maybe this might be something, let's say that I want to speed up because it's some type of power up. I could change my speed, make myself go slower or faster as a power up, and then after a certain period of time, I can go back to my previous speed. So if I hold that, then I can, change back to it. So I can say this dot previous speed is equal to speed. I'm calling that right before I change my speed value. Maybe I can do an increase speed. And I could say, and I might want to just continue to keep this previous speed is the old speed. And then I can do this dot speed plus equals that value. Okay, so these are, basically that we might need to do a reset speed. So reset speed, and I don't need to pass a value. It will be this dot speed is this dot previous speed. Okay, so that is for my player. Now, if I implement this right, that means I need to go to my index and I need to add my player, and the player is going to inherit from dynamic creature. So I want to come down here and I'm going to change my player. Okay, so all I did was I created that class and then put it in my stuff. I just changed a couple functions. So when we are running this, we should see nothing really changed. But now instead of me passing in a dynamic creature, I'm going to do a player. So I just refactored. Why did it do that? Player. There we go. It's the exact same thing. I'm now a player, okay, instead of the dynamic creature. That means I have those change speeds. Okay, so now we can also start thinking about that for the enemy. I am going to want to implement an enemy. And the enemy is going to be almost exactly the same as the dynamic creature. But enemies need to know, if they're coming towards my player, they're going to need to know how close they are to the player. Trying to swipe and I'm using the wrong one. If my enemy is getting close to the player, the enemy is going to need to know where the player's position is, how the player is doing. Maybe the enemy needs to know the player's health to be able to make those decisions. Okay, so I do need to have my enemy designed a little bit different than just the normal player. So in order to do this, I'm going to need to have another class. And we will call this enemy. Now, like what I said before, we could have flying, we could have flying enemies, we could have ground enemies, we could have a boss orc, we could have, an elite orc. We could do different stuff. So in this case, we're probably going to refactor, but right now we're just implementing one enemy. Okay, so class enemy extends dynamic creature. Okay, constructor is going to be the same. I'm putting all of this stuff in here. However, there's going to be a little bit different. Okay. Even though I'm passing in this stuff, and then I'm calling the super and passing that in, I need to have an additional requirement. I need to know who the player is. Okay, so that the dynamic creature doesn't need, but the enemy does. Okay, so this, most of my stuff is going to be the same. I'm not directly changing the enemy's speed, but I could have that control of the player when I'm looking at the different states. Okay, so let's look at everything that we had need to do to create an enemy. We did animations for the player. We're going to have to do the same thing for the enemy, and then set all of that up. So let's go ahead and just, I'm going to fast forward through this part. We're going to quickly load all of this stuff for the enemy. Okay, so we have that animations all loaded. Now we need to kind of go into our sketch. We have that enemy class. And in this case, instead of me making each individual enemy, we're going to start going through and creating a list of all the enemies. I don't need to check everybody on the list, but it would ultimately make it easier to have a hold of every enemy in the game. So I'm just going to go enemies. And we're going to just reproduce every single function that we see for the player is going to also be for the enemy. So I'm going to do load enemy 1 anim. Setup. We're going to create these enemies. Enemies is an empty bracket. Okay. Now I do see some issues with this here. I have this player and all these animations. That is going to get confusing. So this I want to remove. I don't want to see this all here. I'm going to extract it and put it in its own function. Okay. Now normally we would call this, we would call this a custom function. And this would just be called the init. So we would just call, say, player init. Okay. And everything in there would be what we would do. So then inside of my setup, I'm just calling player init. Okay. This is a very common setup. Okay. Ideally, it should not break anything. We should see what we did. Load. Load enemy 1 anim is not defined. Well, that's because I didn't write it. but that's what I'm calling right here. Okay, so we're doing the player. We're also going to do the enemy this way too. So we're going to do, now we will probably actually do something more like this. We might create a function to load all enemies. So how about enemies init? Okay. Function enemies init. And that would be some type of for of loop. So let enemy of enemies, and then I'm doing this. I'm creating every enemy. Okay, something to this effect. Now we could do that by reading it. We could do it by reading it from some type of file. Maybe I'm doing a number and I want to just load 100 enemies. There's a lot of ways that we could do this. In this case, if I'm doing an enemies one, I'm just going to do something really simple for right now, and we'll refactor later. Enemy one init function enemy one init. Okay, and then I don't actually need to hold that enemy one. That's going to be getting passed into that list. So it'd be a new enemy, and then I got to give it everything like this that we would have. Okay, so let's say I'm passing in, I'm just going to call it enemy one. Okay, our first part is our position. We don't actually want it positioned here. We want it positioned, at least for right now, on the right side of the screen. So I'm just going to say width minus 100. The height can stay the same. The vector, I can leave it as 0. That we're not starting with a movement, but we do have a speed. Dynamic versus map would be true. Dynamic versus dynamic would be true. Friendly would be false. Let's say maybe the health is only 10, and maybe my speed is not 5. Maybe it's 2. I have a slow-moving enemy. Okay. Now, what did we do for all of our player stuff? We added all those animations. So we got to finish loading those, even though we could have an enemy. Okay. So that means that the load enemy one anim would be like the player one anim. So this is loading the run, the jump, the idle, and the die. We need to do the same thing. So I am going to basically just copy this, paste it, and then change wherever I see using the multi-cursor select. We have player, 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 player. This is going to be enemy one, and we have a run is going to be a walk. We don't have a jump. We have an attack. We have an idle, and we have a die. Okay, so now each one of these I'm going to load, and it's going to be loading the exact same way as how we did this. We have a load player die anim list for all the frames, and then we're loading and pushing them. So that means that I need to come back up here. This is my player animations. This is going to be my enemy one animations. So I think multi-cursor select would work really good here too. 1, 2, 3, 4. Let enemy one. I'm just going to put question mark as something that I need to replace. So that is enemy one. This would be his walk, his attack, his idle, and his die. Okay, so those are all of them that we basically need. So then we can come back all the way down to the bottom, and we're going to do each one of these. Okay, so for some of them, I'm going to use this and reload. So if I have more than 10 or more than 9 frames, then I'm going to want to copy the one that is set for loading the extra frames. So I'm going to just put this here. I'm going to call it function load, because my enemy walk I can see is already big. Load enemy 1 walk anim. That's my function. And then I'm going to paste, but now I got to rechange. So this is not idle, it's not idle, and it's not idle. Also not idle, not idle, not idle, not idle. So I can delete each one of those. And this is going to be my walk. Okay, and now I'm not doing player walk anim. I'm going to have to replace that. So this is enemy 1 walk anim. That is the name of this. Now this, the names of the files. It's under enemy 1. So right here, multi-cursor select again. Enemy 1. And then we have it under walk. Walk. And then we're looking for walk 0, 0, 0 to 0, 1, 1. Okay, which just happens to be the same as what we already have. Do I have any more that are like that? My idles also like that. So in this case, now I could just copy this whole thing, making sure that I copy all of it. And I could just change a couple things to make it for my idle. So we're not doing walk, we're doing idle. That's just going to be difficult. Give up. Okay. Walk, idle, idle. That's my idle. This is going to be idle. This is going to be idle. This is going to be idle. It is also 11 frames. Okay, now for the other ones, the die and the attack, those don't have more than 10 frames. So we could basically just take this and modify. So we're going to do load enemy 1 die anim. Die, and we're looking at 0 to 9, and then since we already basically have all of that stuff changed, I just have to do the attack one. So load enemy 1 attack anim. Okay, and that is how many frames? 5. We're going up to 5. Okay, so I'm loading all of those just like what we did with the player. Okay, as long as we didn't make any spelling mistake issues, this should be exactly the same as the player. Now the player also is adding those animations to the player. We're going to do almost the exact same thing. Player init. So here we are loading the enemy 1.add animation. We're going to add the walk, and this is from the right one. Enemy 1 walk anim. The subject is now enemy 1. We could keep everything the same and then only have to make changes if we see fit. So let's do our other ones. So we have enemy, this would be, let's say, an idle. Changing this to idle. We'll do the attack. Change this to attack. And then we got our die. Okay, now if we wanted to check, the last thing that we would need to do is to set our initial state just like this. Let's just see if we didn't mess it up. Enemy 1.set initial state, and we'll do a new idle state. Okay, now this is not going to be the idle state that we're going to want to do for our enemy, but we could quickly run it to see what we got going on. We got some errors. No kidding, because we wrote a bunch of code without checking. Enemy is not defined, where that is. Sketch line 43. New enemy. Did we actually implement it in here? I do not think we did. Okay. Now, remember, we have to have dynamic creature loaded before we can load an enemy. And in this case, we're also passing the player. So we're probably going to want to, the order here, have it like this. There's my enemy class. Another thing that I realized that we didn't do, we're supposed to pass in a handle to the player. Okay. So that would be actually here. Player. Every enemy is going to have a handle to the player. Okay. Load enemy 1 idle anim is not defined. Okay. Let's look at where that is. Line 73. I call the same method idle. Okay, so now I do have it displayed. What we don't see though is when we draw our player. So that's right here. We're drawing, we're updating, and we're displaying our player. The other thing that I did is, even though it didn't error out, I didn't really hold on to that enemy 1. It doesn't exist past here. What I need to actually do is the enemies, I need to push that enemy 1 on there. Okay? And even then, it's still not going to do anything, because what I need to do is I actually need to display my enemies. So doing it this way will actually make it a lot easier, because I can just say for all of my enemies, so I can say let enemy of enemies enemy.update enemy.display. There it is. We are showing the update. There is an issue, I think, with our display, but I don't see it yet. Enemies init, which is going into enemy 1 init. It's creating, adding, setting initial state. Which would go to the idle state but technically these states are created for the player. This is actually an error. It shouldn't be player here. It should be subject. This.subject. So, okay, so they're both in the idle state. So that was a previous error that I've apparently left. Okay, but these states are specifically for the player. They're not for the enemies. We need to actually create our own enemy states, and that's why. And here, this enemy 1, we're going to have our own states for the enemy because these states are going to be very similar, but they're going to end up having more of like an AI component. So I want to basically go to the state, because I know I'm going to copy this whole thing, and inherit from this. So just like these, the jump states and everything are going to end up having this. We're calling the super on it, we're passing it up, and then we're giving values. I want to do something with my enemy. So I'm going to go ahead and do that right now. I'm going to create this enemy state. And for right now, I'm just going to do the walk state. So in here, let's create a file, and we'll call it walk state. Now I'm keeping it nested inside of this enemy folder, the enemy 1 folder, because this walk state might be different than the walk state for any of the other enemies that I have. Okay, so this is going to be class walk state extends state. We're calling the constructor on this. Everything should be basically the same except super subject poppable. Okay, so there is my walk state. Now what do I want to do if I'm going in my walk state? Just like what I'm doing with my player states, I'm going to need to change my animations. So walk state would be like, let's look at the run state, because this would be similar. We are changing the animation. Oop, that's an error right there too. We don't know who's using this state, so it should be this.subject. Okay, but this is basically what we're doing. This.subject, we're changing the animation to what we need. We can also set the position. So actually these could probably get reused for my other state. Okay, so in here, I'm going to have something like this, but we're going to the walk. Okay, and that would be specific for my player. Now, even my positioning, I could change some of this because it looks like it's a little bit offset, and I can tweak that. Okay, so now if I go into start a new sketch with my enemy, go to where we set our initial state. New walk state, and we're passing in that's the wrong one. Starting to get quite a bit of code. Okay, so instead of us doing this idle state that we were passing for our player, we're going to do a new walk state. See what that looks like. I did not pass this in, so there's no reference. Okay, so that means that here in my index, even though I created it, I need to pass this in. Okay, so it's just the same as these states. They have to come after the state. I'm going to put my states here for the enemy, but I have it inside of enemy1 and then underneath states. So enemy1 / states, and then this is walk state. Let's rerun. Okay, so there's his walk state. Now, what do I actually want to do in here? So this is where I need to be kind of thinking of my player's speed. This player right here. I'm taking whatever his speed is, and I'm going to move it. So in this case, this can be, and it depends on how you want to see it. My update is things that I want to happen all the time, but my handle input might be certain things, like I am a certain distance away from my player. I'm also actually slowing things down because I'm calling these every frame. So I do want to comment out some of this stuff. I don't want to actually see this all the time. So that's also in dynamic creature. We don't need to see that. Or where's the other one? Okay, so now we have our enemy. Let's actually start making a move. So we want to go to our walk state. And in this case, I'm not doing an attack yet. That's probably where I'm going to handle input. That's going to be like my AI. But here in my update, I am going to want to be checking my speed. So I'm going to want to say that my Y position of my player is, or not my Y position, my X position. I need him to start moving this way. Okay, so I'm going to say that my this dot subject dot X or dot position dot X is going to be adding, actually it's going to be subtracting because I'm going to the left, this dot subject dot speed plus this dot subject dot player dot speed. It seems like a big mouthful. And there we go. Now we're moving. Now we actually need it to reset though. So we want to check if this dot subject dot position dot X, let's say plus this dot subject dot size. If that is less than 0, that means I'm off the screen. I want to reset to the right. So this dot subject dot, this is actually where I would want to reset. But in this case, I'm going to do return a new walk state. And I'm going to give it a hold to the subject. So this dot subject. And poppable, I'm going to say it's false. Okay, so that's my base state. Now what does that mean though when I enter my state? Okay, I'm giving my Y position. Now let's give our X position. Our X position is going to be to the right of the screen because I want it to reset. This dot subject dot position dot X is going to be equal to width plus, because we need to make it, over to the right of the screen. So I want him somewhere over on the edge, but he could be far over or just a little bit over. So I want him to maybe somewhere, when he resets, to show up close or maybe far away, which would give the impression that it's a different person. So we want him all the way off plus maybe some random value. Let's say from, how about this dot subject dot size as the smallest value that I want, to maybe a multiplying the size by, let's say, like 10. Okay, so now let's run. There my player is moving, or the enemy. He's moving, he's moving, he's moving, he's moving. Okay, now I'm idle. I should actually be changing my speed when I'm idle. So that's another thing that we need to kind of change. And that's where we can look at our player class now. Remember, we have the change speed. When we are changing our speed, and we could do our reset speed. Okay, so we're going to use both of those values. So when I'm idle, what would happen? This would be entering. We are zeroed out on our speed. So this dot subject dot change speed, and I'm going to make it 0. So now let's see. Ooh, what did I do? It's this dot speed. This dot speed. Okay, so our enemy should move slower. Now, when I go into my jump state, or excuse me, my run state for my player, then I want to reset the speed. So we're entering, so it would be this dot subject dot reset speed, and it would go back to that previous speed. So now when we watch, it's going at a pace, and now we're running. Let's see that happen again. He's moving slow, and now it looks like we just started running, and now they're moving faster. Okay, so that is really the first video. I know that this was a lot. What I want you guys to do, we are going to end up linking in the different animations with the different states. We're going to have to build those. But what I need you guys to do is I need you to do enemy 2. I need you to build everything the same for enemy 2 so that enemy 2 is able to display. We don't have to have him show up very often, but we do want him to move. Now, a couple things that you can make different when you're creating the enemy. Enemy 2 could have a little bit of a faster speed. And ultimately, we're going to make some changes on this. But once we start implementing the hitboxes, which is going to be in this next video, then we can start changing the different states for our enemies and determine what we want to do and start designing our AI. All right? Good luck. Have fun.